The morning started like any other for Samuel Fletcher. He woke up in his small tent, stretched his aching back, and looked out at the endless Nebraska plains. Winter was almost over, and after 3 long months of trapping beaver and fox, his pack animals were heavy with furs. He was finally heading home to his lonely cabin. Samuel had been living alone for 5 years now. The memories of losing his wife and 2 young children to cholera still hurt, but the pain had dulled to a constant ache. He preferred the silence of the wilderness to the chatter of towns. Animals were honest. They didn't promise you happiness and then take it away. As he loaded his mules that morning, something felt different. The air carried a strange smell, not the usual scent of prairie grass and wildflowers, but something sharp and bitter, smoke, but not the clean smoke of a campfire. This smelled wrong, like burned fabric and wood mixed together. Samuel climbed onto his horse and followed his nose. The smell grew stronger as he rode toward a small valley between 2 hills. His heart began to beat faster. In all his years on the frontier, he had learned to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming danger. When he reached the top of the hill, Samuel pulled his horse to a stop. Below him lay the remains of what had once been a covered wagon. The canvas top was completely gone, burned away to nothing. The wooden frame stood like the skeleton of some great beast, blackened and twisted. Scattered around the wagon were clothes, pots, and personal belongings, the kind of things families packed when they headed west, looking for a better life. Samuel sat on his horse for a long moment, studying the scene. He had seen attacks before. Sometimes it was Indians defending their land. Sometimes it was desperate men who had lost everything and turned to robbery. Either way, it usually meant death for the travelers. He should ride away. That's what the smart part of his brain told him. Whatever happened here was over, and getting involved would only bring trouble. But something made him climb down from his horse and walk closer to the burned wagon. The attack had happened days ago, maybe even a week. The ashes were cold, and spring rain had washed away most of the evidence. Samuel walked carefully around the wreckage, looking for clues about what had happened. He found a man's hat, torn and dirty, a child's small shoe, a family Bible with pages scattered by the wind. Then he heard it. A sound so soft he almost missed it, a tiny whimper like a kitten calling for its mother. Samuel froze and listened. There it was again, coming from behind the wagon. He walked around the burned frame, stepping carefully over broken pottery and twisted metal. What he saw made him stop breathing. A young woman sat propped against the wagon's back wheel, unconscious. Or nearly so. Her dress was torn and dirty, her brown hair matted with dried blood from a wound on her head. But that wasn't what caught Samuel's attention. In her arms, she held a baby. The little one couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 months old. His clothes were filthy, his face streaked with dirt, but his eyes were bright and alert. When he saw Samuel approaching, something incredible happened. The baby smiled, not just any smile, but a huge gummy grin that lit up his entire face. His little hands reached toward this bearded stranger as if Samuel were an old friend coming for a visit. The baby made happy gurgling sounds and kicked his tiny feet. Samuel felt something crack inside his chest. For 5 years he had kept his heart locked away, safe from any more pain. But that innocent smile hit him like a punch to the gut. This tiny person, who had every reason to be scared and crying, was greeting him with pure joy. Samuel knelt down beside the woman and baby. Up close he could see that the woman was breathing, but barely. The head wound looked serious, and she was clearly in shock. How long had they been sitting here? How had they survived? The baby reached out and grabbed Samuel's finger with his small hand. His grip was surprisingly strong, and he looked directly into Samuel's eyes as if trying to tell him something important. Samuel found himself talking to the child in a gentle voice he hadn't used in years. "Well, hello there, little fellow. What are you doing way out here?" The baby's grin got even bigger, showing his pink gums where tiny teeth were just starting to come through. He babbled something that sounded almost like words, as if he were trying to answer Samuel's question. Samuel looked around the scene again, trying to piece together what had happened. The wagon had been heading west. That much was clear from its position. A family, mother, father, and at least 2 children based on the scattered belongings. The attackers had taken everything of value and burned the rest. But somehow, this woman and baby had survived. The woman stirred slightly and Samuel leaned closer. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Her eyes opened for just a moment, unfocused and confused, before closing again. She was alive, but barely. Hanging on. Samuel faced a choice that would change everything. His cabin was 2 days' ride away. Winter wasn't quite over, and the nights were still cold enough to freeze. He had no experience taking care of a baby or nursing someone back to health. The smart thing would be to ride to the nearest town and get help. But the nearest town was 4 days away, and this woman didn't have 4 days. The baby gurgled again, and squeezed Samuel's finger tighter, as if sensing his thoughts. Those bright eyes seemed to be pleading with him. "Don't leave us. Please don't leave us." Samuel made his decision. He spent the next hour gathering supplies from the scattered wreckage. He found a few baby clothes that hadn't been burned, a small blanket, and a wooden cup he could use for feeding. From his own supplies, he took rope and a tarp to make a travois, a simple stretcher he could pull behind his horse. The hardest part was moving the woman without making her injuries worse. She was completely unconscious now, which was probably a mercy. Samuel wrapped her in his warmest blanket and carefully placed her on the travois. The baby he held close to his chest, surprised by how natural it felt to cradle the small body against him. As they started the long journey to his cabin, Samuel found himself talking to the baby constantly. The little one seemed to enjoy the conversation, responding with smiles and happy sounds that warmed Samuel's heart in ways he had forgotten were possible. "Don't worry, little man," Samuel said as they rode through the afternoon. "We're going to take care of you and your mama. You're safe now." The baby looked up at him with complete trust, and Samuel felt the walls around his heart crumble a little more. He had spent 5 years avoiding attachments, protecting himself from more loss. But sometimes life doesn't give you a choice. Sometimes a baby's innocent smile can break through years of carefully built defenses and remind you what it means to be human. As the sun began to set on their first day together, Samuel realized that finding this woman and child beside that burned wagon hadn't just saved their lives. It might have saved his too. The first night on the trail tested every bit of Samuel's resolve. He had made camp in a small grove of trees, hoping the shelter would protect them from the cold wind that swept across the plains. The woman lay unconscious on the travois, breathing so softly that Samuel had to keep checking to make sure she was still alive. But the baby was wide awake, and he was not happy. The little one had been quiet during the day's travel, seemingly content to bounce gently in Samuel's arms as they rode. But as darkness fell and the temperature dropped, reality set in. The baby was hungry, cold, and missing his mother's comfort. His cries echoed through the quiet night, sharp and desperate. Samuel had never felt so helpless in his life. He could track animals through a blizzard, survive weeks in the wilderness with nothing but his rifle and knife, but he had no idea how to calm a crying baby. He tried everything he could think of. He rocked the little one gently, sang, half-remembered, lullabies his own mother had sung to him, even tried making funny faces in the firelight. Nothing worked. The baby's cries grew louder and more frantic. Then Samuel remembered something. Earlier that day he had noticed the baby trying to suck on his tiny fist. The child was hungry, probably hadn't eaten properly since before the attack, but what could Samuel feed him? He had dried meat, hardtack, and coffee beans. Nothing suitable for a baby who didn't even have teeth yet. That's when he remembered his goat, Bessie. She was tied with his other animals a short distance from camp. Samuel had bought her from a trading post months ago, planning to have fresh milk during his long winter in the wilderness. He had almost traded her away before heading home, but something had made him keep her. Now he knew why. Samuel carefully wrapped the baby in his warmest shirt and laid him near the fire where he would stay warm. Then he went to milk Bessie, talking to her gently so she wouldn't be spooked by the nighttime disturbance. "Easy, girl, we've got a little one who needs your help," he whispered as he worked Bessie seemed to understand the urgency and stood still while Samuel filled his metal cup with warm, fresh milk. Back at the fire, Samuel faced another problem. How do you feed milk to a baby without a proper bottle? He tried dipping his finger in the milk and letting the baby suck on it. The hungry little one caught on quickly. Grabbing Samuel's hand with both of his tiny ones and drinking eagerly, it took a long time. Fingerful by fingerful, but gradually the baby's hunger was satisfied. His cries stopped, replaced by satisfied little sounds. When his belly was full, he looked up at Samuel with those bright eyes and gave him that incredible smile again. "There we go, little fellow," Samuel said softly. "That's better, isn't it?" The baby yawned, a tiny sound that made Samuel's heart squeeze tight. Within minutes, the child was fast asleep in Samuel's arms. Completely trusting and peaceful, Samuel sat by the fire for hours that night, holding the sleeping baby and watching over the unconscious woman. He found himself studying the child's face in the firelight. The little one had dark hair like his mother, but his features were different. Probably favored his father, wherever that poor man was now. As the night wore on, Samuel started talking to the baby even though he was asleep. It felt natural somehow, like the child was listening even in his dreams. "I don't know what I'm doing here, little man," Samuel admitted quietly. "I've been alone so long I forgot how to take care of anyone but myself. But you're going to need a lot of taking care of, aren't you?" The baby stirred slightly in his sleep, as if responding to Samuel's voice. "Your mama's going to be all right," Samuel continued. "I'm going to make sure of that. And you're going to grow up strong and happy, I promise you that." Making that promise scared Samuel more than facing down a mountain lion. He had learned the hard way that life could take away everything you loved without warning. But looking down at this innocent child, he couldn't help himself. He wanted to protect this little life, to give him a chance at happiness. The second day of travel was easier in some ways, harder in others. Samuel had figured out a routine for feeding the baby, and he had fashioned a proper sling from his spare shirt so the child could ride comfortably against his chest. The little one seemed to enjoy the motion of the horse and the steady rhythm of Samuel's heartbeat, but the woman was getting worse. She had developed a fever during the night, and she kept mumbling in her sleep. Samuel could only catch fragments of what she was saying, but it was clear she was reliving the attack in her dreams. "Thomas," she would whisper, her voice thick with pain. "Where's Thomas? We have to find Thomas." Sometimes she would cry out suddenly, her body jerking as if she were trying to run or fight. During these episodes, the baby would fuss and reach toward his mother. Somehow, sensing her distress even though he couldn't understand what was happening, Samuel found himself torn between worry for the woman and amazement at the baby's awareness. The little one was clearly smart, noticing everything around him with curious eyes. When they passed the hawk circling overhead, the baby pointed and made excited sounds. When Samuel's horse nickered, the child tried to copy the sound, making Samuel laugh despite his worries. "You're going to be a talker, aren't you?" Samuel said to the baby as they rode. "I can tell you've got a lot to say about everything." The baby responded with a string of babbling that almost sounded like a conversation. Samuel found himself answering, carrying on a nonsensical dialogue that somehow made perfect sense to both of them. By afternoon, the woman's fever had broken and she seemed more peaceful. The baby had settled into a contented drowse against Samuel's chest, occasionally waking to smile at his protector before drifting off again. Samuel realized something was happening to him. The walls he had built around his heart were crumbling stone by stone. Every time the baby smiled at him, every time those tiny hands grabbed his finger, every satisfied sigh after feeding time, it all chipped away at his carefully maintained isolation. He had spent 5 years telling himself he was better off alone, that caring about people only led to heartbreak. But this little person in his arms was teaching him something different. Maybe the risk of loss was worth it if it meant experiencing this pure, uncomplicated love. As they made camp for their second night, Samuel looked down at the sleeping baby and made another silent promise. Whatever happened when they reached his cabin, whatever challenges lay ahead, he would not abandon this child. Something had brought them together beside that burned wagon, and Samuel was beginning to believe it might have been more than just chance. The baby shifted in his sleep and smiled, as if he could hear Samuel's thoughts. In that moment, Samuel knew his life had changed forever. He was no longer just a lonely trapper heading home. He was a man with people depending on him. And surprisingly, that felt like exactly where he was meant to be. Samuel's cabin had never felt so small. For 5 years, it had been his perfect retreat from the world. One room with a stone fireplace, a simple bed, a table, and shelves for his supplies. Now, with a sick woman and a baby, it felt like he was trying to fit an entire family into a closet. The woman had been unconscious for 3 days since they arrived. Samuel had made her as comfortable as possible on his own bed while he slept on the floor near the fireplace. The baby, who Samuel had started calling Little Grinned because of his constant smiles, seemed to be thriving despite everything. He was crawling now, pulling himself around the cabin floor with determination that amazed Samuel. On the 4th morning, Samuel was feeding Little Grinned his breakfast of warm goat milk when he heard something that made his heart jump. A voice, weak but clear, came from the bed. Where am I? Samuel turned to see the woman's eyes open for the first time since he'd found her. She was looking around the cabin with confusion and fear. When her gaze fell on Samuel, she tried to sit up quickly, then fell back with a gasp of pain. Easy now, Samuel said gently, setting down the baby's cup. You're safe. You've been hurt, but you're safe. The woman's eyes darted around the room until they found the baby. Little Grinned had heard his mother's voice and was crawling toward the bed, as fast as his little hands and knees could carry him. When he reached the bed, he pulled himself up and reached for his mother with happy sounds. Jacob, the woman whispered, tears streaming down her face. Oh, Jacob, my sweet boy. So that was his name. Samuel felt a strange pang at learning it. He had grown so used to thinking of the child as Little Grinned that Jacob seemed like a stranger's name. The woman, Jacob's mother, tried to lift her son, but her arms were too weak. Samuel quickly scooped up the baby and gently placed him next to his mother on the bed. Jacob immediately snuggled against her, making contented sounds. How long? She asked Samuel, her voice barely above a whisper. A week since I found you, Samuel replied. You've been in and out of consciousness. That head wound was pretty serious. The woman closed her eyes, and Samuel could see her trying to remember. When she opened them again, they were filled with a pain that had nothing to do with her physical injuries. They're gone, she said simply. Thomas and little Rose, they're both gone. Samuel nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He had figured as much from the scene at the wagon, but hearing her say it made it real in a way that hit him hard. I'm Mary Catherine, she said after a long moment. Mary Catherine Walsh, and this is Jacob. He's 10 months old. Samuel Fletcher, he replied. This is my cabin. You're both welcome to stay as long as you need. Over the next several days, Mary Catherine slowly regained her strength. Samuel learned her story piece by piece, during quiet moments when Jacob was napping. She and her husband Thomas had been traveling from Missouri to Oregon with their 2 children. They had joined a wagon train in Independence, but Thomas had gotten sick with fever and they'd fallen behind the group. We should have waited, Mary Catherine said one evening as they sat by the fire. Jacob was playing on a blanket at their feet, trying to stack wooden blocks Samuel had carved for him. Thomas was so eager to catch up, he insisted we travel alone. Said we could make better time without the big group. Samuel didn't point out that traveling alone had been dangerous. She knew that better than anyone now. The men who attacked us, she continued, they weren't Indians like we'd been warned about. They were white men, desperate and mean. They came at us just after dawn when Thomas was hitching up the oxen. She paused, watching Jacob knock down his tower of blocks and clap his hands with delight. Thomas tried to fight them off. He told me to take the children and hide under the wagon. But Rose ... she was only 6 years old. She got scared and ran, one of the men. Mary Catherine couldn't finish the sentence, but Samuel understood. He reached over and gently touched her hand. You don't have to talk about it, he said. I need to, she replied. I need someone to know what happened to them. So Samuel listened while she told him about watching her husband die trying to protect his family, about hiding under the wagon with Jacob while the attackers burned everything they couldn't steal, about staying perfectly still for hours after the men left, even when Jacob cried from hunger. "Why didn't you try to get help?" Samuel asked gently. "Where would I go?" "Mary," Catherine asked. "We were miles from anywhere, and I didn't know which direction to walk. I kept thinking someone would come looking for us, but nobody did." Samuel understood why. The wagon train had probably assumed they had changed their minds about Oregon and turned back. By the time anyone realized they were missing, the trail would have been cold dot as Mary Catherine recovered. Samuel watched her interact with Jacob and marveled at the strength of mothers. Despite everything she had been through, despite her grief and pain, she still had endless patience for her son. She sang to him, played with him, told him stories. Jacob, in turn, seemed to sense that his mother needed comfort and would often crawl over to pat her face or give her sloppy baby kisses, but Samuel also noticed something else. Jacob had grown attached to him during the week when Mary Catherine was unconscious. The baby would look for Samuel when he left the cabin, and he had started making a sound that might have been Sam when he wanted attention, sometimes Jacob would crawl back and forth between Samuel and his mother, as if trying to include both of them in his games. One evening, as winter finally began to loosen its grip on the land, Mary Catherine made an announcement that Samuel had been dreading. "I've been thinking," she said as she tucked Jacob into the makeshift cradle Samuel had built. "When I'm strong enough to travel, I want to continue to Oregon. Thomas and I had dreams there, plans for a new life. I think I owe it to his memory to see them through." Samuel felt his heart sink, but he just nodded. He had known this moment would come. Mary Catherine had her own life to live, and he had no right to expect her to stay in his lonely cabin forever. "Of course," he said. "When you're ready, I'll take you to the nearest town. Help you find a wagon train heading west." That night, Samuel lay on his blankets by the fire, staring at the ceiling and listening to Jacob's soft breathing. The baby had become such a part of his daily routine that he couldn't imagine the cabin without him. Who would he talk to while doing chores? Who would smile at him like he was the most wonderful person in the world? For the first time in years, Samuel allowed himself to admit how lonely he had been. Mary Catherine and Jacob had filled his cabin with warmth and laughter, with purpose and meaning. When they left, he would be alone again, but now he knew what. He was missing Dot, as if sensing his thoughts. Jacob stirred in his sleep and made a small sound that might have been Sam. Samuel smiled despite his sadness. Whatever happened, he would always have these memories of a baby's unconditional love and a brave woman's trust. Sometimes he thought that had to be enough. Spring arrived with a rush of green grass and wildflowers, but Samuel barely noticed the beauty around him. Every warm day reminded him that Mary Catherine was getting stronger, and stronger meant she would soon be ready to leave. He tried to act normal, going about his daily chores and playing with Jacob as usual, but inside his heart was breaking a little more each day. Jacob was walking now, taking wobbly steps between the furniture and babbling constantly. His favorite word was Sam Sam, which he would shout with delight whenever Samuel entered the room. The sound never failed to make Samuel smile. Even on his darkest days, Mary Catherine had noticed Samuel's quiet mood, but she didn't say anything about it. Instead, she threw herself into preparing for the journey west. She mended clothes, organized supplies, and talked constantly about Oregon and the new life waiting there. Thomas always said the soil in Oregon was so rich you could grow anything, she would say while folding Jacob's tiny shirts. He planned to start with wheat, then maybe add some fruit trees. "Can you imagine, Sam? Fresh apples right from your own land?" Samuel would nod and make encouraging sounds, but each word felt like a nail in his heart. He had started having dreams about the empty cabin, about eating silent meals and talking to no one but his animals. The thought of going back to that. Loneliness seemed impossible now. Everything changed on a warm Tuesday morning when they heard the sound of approaching horses. Samuel stepped outside to see a small group of riders coming toward the cabin, a man in preacher's clothing. a woman and 2 young children on a second horse. "Good morning," the preacher called out as they drew near. "I'm Reverend William Miller, and this is my wife Helen and our children. We're traveling to Oregon and wondered if we might water our horses at your stream." Samuel welcomed them, as was the custom on the frontier. Any traveler could expect basic hospitality from homesteaders. Mary Catherine came out of the cabin carrying Jacob, who immediately hid his face in his mother's shoulder at the sight of strangers. Helen Miller took one look at Mary Catherine and Jacob and immediately understood the situation. "Oh my," she said with genuine warmth. "What a beautiful baby." "How old is he?" "Almost 11 months, Mary Catherine replied, her voice shy but friendly. As the day progressed, the Millers shared their story. They were part of a group of families headed to Oregon to start a new church community. They had good wagons, experienced guides, and plenty of supplies. When Mary Catherine mentioned her own plans to go west, Helen's eyes lit up. "You must come with us," Helen said immediately. Single woman traveling alone with a baby, that's far too dangerous. We have plenty of room, and our children would love to have a little one to help care for." Samuel felt his stomach drop as he watched Mary Catherine's face brighten with interest. This was exactly what she needed, safe passage west with good people who would help her start over. "When do you leave?" Mary Catherine asked. "Next week," Reverend Miller replied. "We're meeting the rest of our group in North Platte, then heading out on the Oregon Trail. It would be our pleasure to have you and your son join us." That evening, after the Millers had made camp by the stream, Mary Catherine was more excited than Samuel had seen her since she'd recovered from her injuries. "It's perfect, Sam," she said as she put Jacob to bed. "They seem like wonderful people, and their children are so well behaved. Jacob would have playmates, and I'd have other women to talk to. It's like God has provided exactly what we need." Samuel forced a smile. "It sounds like a great opportunity," he said, hating how hollow his voice sounded. But as the days passed, Samuel noticed something that gave him hope. Jacob was not happy about the strangers. Every time Helen Miller tried to hold him or play with him, he would cry and reach for Samuel. When the Miller children attempted to get him to play, Jacob would run to Samuel's legs and refuse to let go. Most telling of all, Jacob had stopped sleeping well. He would wake up crying in the middle of the night, and only Samuel could calm him down. Mary Catherine would try first, but Jacob would continue fussing until Samuel picked him up. Then he would immediately settle, wrap his tiny arms around Samuel's neck, and fall back asleep. "I don't understand what's wrong with him," Mary Catherine said one morning after a particularly difficult night. "He's never been this clingy before." Samuel thought he understood perfectly. Jacob could sense the tension in the air, the preparations for leaving. The smart little boy knew something was changing, and he didn't like it. Helen Miller had noticed Jacob's behavior too, and she wasn't pleased. "That child is far too attached to Mr. Fletcher," she told Mary Catherine one afternoon when she thought Samuel couldn't hear. "It's not healthy for a boy to be so dependent on a man who isn't his father. He needs to learn to bond with appropriate people." Samuel felt anger rise in his chest at her words, but he kept quiet. She wasn't wrong that Jacob was attached to him, but calling it unhealthy seemed cruel. The breaking point came 3 days before the Millers were scheduled to leave. Mary Catherine had spent the morning packing her few belongings, and Jacob had grown increasingly upset as he watched familiar things disappear into bags and boxes. When Samuel returned from checking on his animals, he found Jacob sitting in the middle of the floor, crying harder than he had ever seen the child cry. It wasn't his usual fussy crying or his hungry crying. This was heartbroken sobbing, the kind that came from deep inside. Mary Catherine was kneeling beside him, trying everything to comfort her son, but Jacob pushed her away and crawled toward Samuel with desperate urgency. "Sam, Sam," Jacob cried, reaching up with both arms. "Sam, Sam." Samuel picked up the little boy, who immediately wrapped his arms around Samuel's neck and clung to him like his life depended on it. The crying stopped instantly, but Jacob's whole body shook with leftover sobs. "He knows," Samuel said quietly, meeting Mary Catherine's eyes over Jacob's head. "He knows you're leaving." Mary Catherine sank into a chair, tears streaming down her face. I don't know what to do, Sam. This is our chance for a new life, but Jacob is so upset. Maybe if I give him more time to get used to the idea. How much time does an 11-month-old need to get used to losing another father figure? Samuel asked gently. The words hung in the air between them. Mary Catherine stared at Samuel with wide eyes, as if she was seeing him clearly for the first time. Is that what you are to him? She whispered. A father figure? Samuel looked down at Jacob, who had finally stopped crying but was still clinging tightly. The little boy's trust and love had crept into Samuel's heart so gradually that he hadn't realized how deep it went until this moment. I think maybe I am, Samuel admitted. And I think maybe that's what I want to be. Mary Catherine was quiet for a long time, watching Samuel hold her son. Finally she spoke in a voice so soft Samuel almost missed it. What if we didn't have to choose? What if there was another way? Samuel's heart began to beat faster, but he was afraid to hope. What do you mean? Mary Catherine stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the spring landscape. What if Oregon isn't the only place to start over? What if home could be right here? The morning sun was just breaking over the hills when Samuel made his decision. He had spent the entire night sitting by the dying fire, holding Jacob while the little boy slept peacefully in his arms. Mary Catherine had gone to bed hours ago, but Samuel could hear her tossing and turning. As restless as he was, today the Millers would be leaving, and they expected Mary Catherine and Jacob to go with them. But Samuel couldn't let that happen. Not without fighting for what had become the most important thing in his life, this makeshift family that had healed his broken heart. As quietly as he could, Samuel placed Jacob in his crib and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp and, sweet, filled with the promise of summer. He walked to the small hill behind his cabin where he could see for miles in every direction. This land had been his refuge for 5 years, but now it could be something more. It could be home for all of them. When he returned to the cabin, Mary Catherine was awake, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. She looked like she hadn't slept at all. Jacob was still sleeping, one tiny fist curled near his face. Mary Catherine, Samuel said, his voice quiet but determined. I need to tell you something before the Millers wake up. She looked up at him, and Samuel could see the same confusion and pain in her eyes that he felt in his heart. I know you think going to Oregon is the right thing to do, Samuel continued. I know you made promises to Thomas, and I respect that. But I have something to ask you, and I need you to hear me out completely before you answer. Mary Catherine nodded, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup like it could give her strength. Samuel sat down across from her and took a deep breath. I'm in love with you, he said simply. I'm in love with you, and I'm in love with that little boy over there who calls me Sam. I know it's crazy. I know we've only known each other for a few months. But somewhere along the way, you two became my whole world. Mary Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. I'm not asking you to forget Thomas, Samuel went on. I would never ask that. He was Jacob's father, and he was your husband, and he deserves to be remembered. But he's gone, Mary Catherine. And we're here, alive, and we found something beautiful together. Samuel reached across the table and gently took her hand. I want to marry you. Not because you need taking care of, but because I can't imagine my life without you and Jacob in it. I want to build something here, together. A farm, a family, a real home. The tears were flowing freely down Mary Catherine's cheeks now. Sam, she whispered, I don't know what to say. Say what you feel, Samuel said. Not what you think you should feel, or what you think Thomas would want, or what makes the most sense. Just tell me what's in your heart. Mary Catherine was quiet for a long moment, looking down at their joined hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft Samuel had to lean forward to hear her. I'm scared, she admitted. I'm scared because I do love you. I've been fighting it for weeks, telling myself it was just gratitude or loneliness, but it's not. I love the way you sing to Jacob when you think I'm not listening. I love how you carved him those wooden blocks and spent hours teaching him to stack them. I love how gentle you are, How safe you make me feel." Samuel's heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. "But I'm also terrified," Mary Catherine continued. "I lost everything once. My husband, my daughter, my whole life. What if something happens again? What if I let myself be happy and then lose it all?" Samuel squeezed her hand gently. "I can't promise that nothing bad will ever happen," he said honestly. "Life doesn't work that way. But I can promise that whatever comes, we'll face it together. You won't be alone anymore." Just then, Jacob woke up with his usual happy babbling. He pulled himself up in his crib and looked around until he spotted Samuel. His whole face lit up with that incredible smile. Sam," Jacob called out, reaching his arms toward Samuel. Sam." Samuel stood up and lifted Jacob from his crib, and the little boy immediately wrapped his arms around Samuel's neck. Jacob looked over at his mother and babbled something that sounded almost like words, as if he were trying to join their conversation. "Even Jacob knows," Mary Catherine said, laughing through her tears. "Look at him. He's trying to tell us what he thinks we should do." Samuel sat back down, settling Jacob on his lap. The little boy looked back and forth between the two adults, seeming to sense the importance of the moment. "What about Oregon?" Mary Catherine asked. "What about the dreams Thomas and I had?" "Oregon will still be there if you change your mind," Samuel said. "But Mary Catherine, dreams change, people change. Maybe Thomas's dream was Oregon, but maybe yours is something different now." Mary Catherine reached over and touched Jacob's cheek, then looked into Samuel's eyes. "What kind of life are you offering us, Sam?" Samuel's face broke into a smile. "A simple one," he said. "I've got enough money saved from trapping to buy some good farmland down in the valley. We could build a real house, plant crops, maybe get some chickens and a pig. Jacob could grow up with space to run and explore. We could have more children if you want them." "More children," Mary Catherine repeated softly, and Samuel could see the longing in her eyes. "I want to give Jacob brothers and sisters," Samuel said. "I want to teach him to fish and hunt and work the land. I want to watch you plant a garden and fill our house with flowers. I want to grow old with you, Mary Catherine." Outside, they could hear the millers stirring in their camp, getting ready for another day of travel toward Oregon. But inside the cabin, time seemed to stand still. Jacob chose that moment to make his opinion known. He looked at Samuel, then at his mother, then clapped his hands together and laughed with pure joy. It was as if he were celebrating something wonderful. "I think he approves," Mary Catherine said, smiling for the first time in days. "Is that a yes?" Samuel asked, hardly daring to hope. Mary Catherine looked around the cabin that had become home, at the man who had saved her life and won her heart, at her son who was happier than she had ever seen him. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Sam, let's build a life together." Samuel leaned across the table and kissed her gently, while Jacob clapped his hands and babbled happily between them. When they broke apart, Mary Catherine was smiling through her tears. "Should we go tell the millers?" she asked. Samuel nodded, but first he lifted Jacob high in the air, making the little boy giggle with delight. "What do you think, Jacob? Ready to stay home with your new papa?" Jacob's response was his biggest smile yet, and Samuel knew that everything was exactly as it should be. Later that morning, Reverend Miller performed a simple wedding ceremony by the stream. Mary Catherine wore wildflowers in her hair, and Jacob sat contentedly in Samuel's arms throughout the whole service. When it was over, the Millers continued their journey west, but Samuel, Mary Catherine, and Jacob began a different kind of journey, one that would last the rest of their lives. Years later, when Jacob was older and had little brothers and sisters of his own, he would ask Samuel to tell him the story of how they became a family. And Samuel would always begin the same way. "Once upon a time, a baby's smile saved a lonely man's heart, and taught him that the best families are the ones you choose to love."